Hello and welcome back to Billy Goat Wargaming, and something a little bit different today, a rules review. So we have Regiment of Foote. Now this is the second version of Regiment of Foote. It was published in 2016 by Peter Pigg through the Rules for the Common Man group of rules that Peter Pigg release. And as it says on the cover, it tells you what it does. Rules for English Civil War battles, Royalist parliamentarians and Covenanters, on a grid-based 4x3 table. Games last roughly 2 hours, and it's written for 15mm with conversions for all scales, and there's a couple of nice lobster pot helmets there. So this is 15mm. This is Peter Pigg's in-house English Civil War rule set. They obviously produce an absolutely beautiful English Civil War range in 15mm. Inside the front cover here we have battle preparation. I'll come to this shortly. This is the sort of pre-battle sequence that sets up the scenario. And you have to imagine this is the tabletop on which the generals are plotting out the next day's events and how they might secure some extra stores and powder, or carry out some scouting, or recruit some more men. See if they can push those men on for the cause that they're fighting, and then eventually to give battle. Anybody who's played Peter Pigg games before will know the format of these rules pretty well. Peter Pigg have been using square-based rules for some time now, and they bring a certain speed of play, let's say, and a lack of complication as to movements, ranges, that kind of thing. And you do not have to make your tabletop look like it's a grid base. There's ways in which you can manipulate the scenery to make it look not like a grid, is probably the best way to say it. So we have the introduction here. It tells us what the book consists of. We have the game scenario generator, we have the battle rules, a battle sheet and a play sheet. There's also, very interestingly, siege rules, and then scenarios for fighting actual battles, which we'll come on to very shortly. So we have a list of events throughout the historical period from 1642 to 1660. All the events here with the various battles and movements of troops, and then we go on to ground and figure scale. So it tells us here basic scaling information. One scale is equivalent to roughly 35 meters. That's give or take, actually, and it doesn't particularly matter. So 15 centimeters is equal to 3,000 real centimeters, giving a scale of roughly 1 to 200. So if you're playing this in 10mm, that would be roughly the figure scale would be bang on to the ground scale. And one figure equals 40 real men, one artillery gun, a pair of guns. Base sizes are roughly 3 centimeters square for 15mm for foot troops, and then 30 by 40 for horse and guns, although the very small guns will be on a 30 by 32. And there's a bit of advice there if you're going to play outside of 15mm, whether it be 5mm or larger scales than 25/28mm. A dictionary of definitions used within the game, like aggression marker or rules for the common man. The rules are written with playability and a feel for the period in view as the main criteria, using ordinary 6-sided dice and the same basing conventions as other Peter Pigg rule sets. And we have the battle sheet, which I think there will be a copy of on the... It might be further through the rules. We'll come to that shortly, but it's certainly downloadable from the Peter Pigg website if there isn't a copy within here. Some gaming conventions. There are many mechanisms in Regiment of Foote which are familiar to players of other RFCM games. It is still in order to give a few guidance notes of how this game will be played. So right to left is quite important. So throughout the game, players should carry out all their actions right to left. So death rolls, cannonades, morale, movement, shooting. And the reason for that is that it prevents players from forgetting something, allows the opponent to follow why the player is rolling some dice, and prevents the player making complex sequences of actions in order to attempt to gain an advantage. So a bit about dice there. We've got re-rolls, handling the figures, declarations. So you must tell your opponent what you're rolling for. And then we have markers. Now you can use card markers, as you can see here, or you can create something a bit more aesthetically appropriate. And there is some markers to cut out right at the back of the rules there. I would recommend putting them on some coloured card. Probably green would be less obtrusive on the table. But again, you could come up with some other sort of fancy way of indicating the various markers that are required, which are aggression, where each marker adds +1d6 to a fight. An attack, which can be a general's gift, we'll come on to that shortly. Casualties, defend, or morale are general's gifts as well. So those are sort of general's abilities within the game. Fierce shooting, the swords and powder points advantage outcome allows the whole square to re-roll shooting. That's pretty impressive. A lucky dog, this causes points advantage outcomes, adds 2d6 to a fight. So there is a little dog that you can buy, and a preacher so the dog will put more energy into the troops who are fighting, and the preacher will help with morale tests, which seems remarkably appropriate. Siege markers, winning the fight markers, a breach party, that's for the siege game. The table then, as I've mentioned, is 4 foot by 3 foot, which makes 8 by 6 squares. And again, there's a little table here to help you. So if you're playing in 5, 6 or 10 mil, your table's only going to be 32 inches by 24 inches. You can almost play that on your lap, which is very good for those who are short of space. So there's 48 squares, and whenever you're counting rows, the defender's row is number 1, moving over to the attacker's row, who is in row 6. And there's a picture of the armies deployed, and a depiction of the table. Game setup sequence, so there's some pre-game activities like building and painting your army and agreeing on a venue where you're going to play. Show your opponent your army so you can tell him or her what quality your troops are, what type of troops you've got. Then you choose scenery, and then you go through some various dice rolling mechanisms which will decide what kind of general you've got, generate the scenario, decide who's the attacker and defender, lay out the scenery, and then towards the end of the sequence, which probably takes 10 to 15 minutes, I would say, maximum to carry out, you have what are called death rolls, and that reduces the defender's army on the table to give the attacker a fighting chance, because the general maxim is you need 3 to 1 to be able to carry out an attack on defenders who are already in situ and behind hedges, or defending buildings, etc. And then there's a cannonade. So a lot of Civil War battles would open with an artillery cannonade, so that can be carried out. And then the attacker has the first turn. And then there's a section on building an army. So it's a points-based system where troops and bases are formed into units. A unit is a collection of one or more bases, typically 3 bases for infantry and 2 bases for horse. And here you can see them laid out. Now, a lot of people will have chosen to use these sabot bases to make the moving of the figures a lot easier. It's absolutely optional, you don't need that, but it's quite a good idea. And you could write the quality of the troop types. As you can see there, it says conscript on the edge. Here we have a horse unit, which is a full strength unit. If that had dropped, so each base has 2 hit points essentially. So if a base takes 1 hit, you remove the base, put down half a base and a casualty, and the second hit will kill the whole base, but it still fights at full effectiveness until it's destroyed. When a unit goes below 1.5 bases, it loses strength and becomes not as effective in the game. We've got some dragoons here, which generally are represented dismounted, but you could certainly put a mounted figure on there if you wish, and then a gun. Troop attributes, so we've got musketeers armed with a musket with or without a rest. They can shoot up to 1 square range, including diagonally, and you shoot once during each opponent's turn, which might take a little bit of getting used to. So you shoot in your opponent's turn. Pikemen are foot armed with a pike, and the more pike you've got, the more advantage you will have in a close assault or a melee. And then we've got the rules about dragoons, usually depicted as on foot, as I say, but you could use mounted and mix them into the units, it matters not. Dragoons can be pushed forward before the game starts, so you will deploy your dragoons in your battle line, but you can push them forward to occupy woods, buildings, marsh, or behind a hedge to occupy that piece of terrain and take advantage, which is quite often what happened. And then 1 or 2 other bits and pieces about how you deal with dragoons when they're shooting and fighting. And we have pistoler cavalry using pistols and assaulting at the trot. They can shoot at targets on the face only. That means a facing square, not diagonally. Charger cavalry are there to basically charge straight at the enemy. They can't shoot, but they do get a bonus when charging into melee, and they will lose that bonus during the course of the game as the horses become blown. Cuirassiers, there wasn't many of these obviously in the English Civil War, but they were there as armoured cavalry. They get a better save. And then separate rules for Highlanders, talking about how aggressive they are and how to deal with those. We've got artillery, which can be light, medium or heavy guns, each doing successively more damage should they hit. Troop quality is divided into 3. We've got veterans, trained and conscripts, and then base size and details. So it tells you here for muskets and pikes, 3 or 4 figures to a base, or 4 or 5 figures for pikes. You're going to include a commanding officer and maybe a drummer in there as well, and the general base sizes too. And then the point system, so standard game, an army will use 160 points. There's the various points levels there. You can have a high pike regiment of foot, or a high musket regiment of foot. High pike only in early war armies, and high muskets in late war armies. So you can vary the content of pikes to muskets within your units. There's an example army there which gives you 9 units of foot, 4 units of pistoler cavalry, 4 units of charger cavalry, 4 guns, 3 units of dragoons, and that would be an example army as played out in these rules. And then we move on to the army lists, and these would be as you would expect: early war royalist, late war royalist, late war parliamentarian, Montrose Royalist Scots, early war parliament and new model army, and then Scots Covenanters, and all the details there about how you form the armies. And then we move on to scenery. So lots of different scenery types, like a building template. So this could be the edge of a village or a wealthy farm. Or a stream positioned between 2 rows of squares. A nasty hedge, I love this description. A nasty hedge forms an L shape, so if you've got 2 of those you would form an enclosure, but it's always in this L shape, so it's always 2 squares long and 1 square deep. And then gentle hill, which takes up 2 squares, an area of rough ground, marsh, or a field. All treated the same in regiments of foot. They provide no cover but slow movement. So that could be standing crops, it could be rabbit warrens, as was often encountered. We've got a wood, which is a common feature on English Civil War battlefields, which will provide cover. And then we have a rough hill, so this is a hill that perhaps has got some rocky outcrops on it, or is particularly rough going and more difficult for troops to manoeuvre across. So within the standard game, so not playing a historical battle or the siege game, then each player will bring a certain amount of scenery to the table, and there's certain maximums that are allowed. So you couldn't have a table full of rough ground, for instance, or just nasty hedges. There's certain amounts that you are allowed and the impact that they have. And there's a typical layout of some scenery. So some buildings, we've got some rough ground, looks like a rough hill here, and then two gentle hills. We've got a stream bisecting the table there. So streams a stream is not considered as to be in any square, but it's a barrier between squares. Thus it has no effect unless it is between two squares fighting or in the path of movement. The stream could equally be a ditch, as they both have the same effect. Rivers are not used in Regiment of Foot, as their presence would probably prevent a standard battle happening. And then generals. There's a system called gifts which are awarded to generals, and there's a dice roll mechanism to see which of your generals has which gift. They can have all three, or they can have none. You will have three generals in the standard game to play with. One will be your CNC, and the other two will be his subordinate generals, and they can be an attack motivated general who can re-roll the fight dice if assaulting, a defend general who can will allow fight dice to be re-rolled if the target, and then a morale general who will allow morale to be re-rolled. And there's a nice picture of a general with some Peter Pig produced markers on it. Some rules there about moving generals, hits on generals, generals getting killed, and then we've got this battle preparation. Now this is a black and white version of the inside of the front cover, and basically there's a bit of a dice game here. I won't go into the details of it, but you move around this map here, picking up some advantages hopefully as you go, which will aid you during the coming game, and there'll also be a determination who will be the attacker and the defender. And this is a continuation of that system. So for instance, if you do very well in the square called the cause, you might get the preacher coming along with your army. So you place a preacher marker with a unit of choice. The marker can be used to re-roll a complete morale test for the whole square in the game. It is used when the player wishes, not necessarily in the first morale test inflicted, but the marker is lost when its owning unit is removed from the game. And then after each use, the preacher is removed unless a 4, 5 or 6 is rolled to retain it. So those sorts of things just add a little bit of flavour, a little bit of interest outside of the general moving, shooting, fighting morale system. So squares can have up to 3 units in it, whether it's foot, cavalry, a dragoon unit or guns. Generals don't count. We have the setting up of the table, and the attacker will take ownership of some of the scenery, with the defender then remaining placing the rest. Once the table's laid out, there's a system called nudging, where means the scenery, which will mean the scenery could move a bit, but is not transplanted large distances around the table. So if I place a wood in a couple of squares, my opponent might get a chance to move it north, south, east or west. And then troop deployment, it'll be no surprise that for anybody familiar with English Civil War cavalry, will tend to be on the flanks and the infantry in the centre. Then we have this death roll mechanism. This is whereby the defender's army suffers some attrition prior to the start of the game, which can go into reinforcements, but will then encourage the attacking general to get on with the game and try and defeat the enemy in detail prior to the arrival of the defender's reinforcements. And we have a cannonade, so each gun will have a shot at the enemy in the cannonade section as the ball gets rolling, and then we move to the on table turn sequence, where the attacker will have first turn. which generally will be start with the moving of generals, then a morale test for a square that you're activating, movement of that square, and any fights caused by the movement of those units, and then the opponent gets to shoot. So the opponent always shoots in your turn, and you shoot in your opponent's turn, and that has always got to be right to left. So there's the morale. So it's generally similar to other Peter Pig games in that you create a pile of dice for the relevant causes of a morale test. So per casualty marker, if you've got conscripts in the square, if per face of square occupied by the enemy, so you've got enemy on your front face and on your flank, that's bad news. But you take 1 dice away if you have an advantage, and this is just you claim this once, so it could be a veteran unit in the square defending a nasty hedge or wall on a hill, have lots of pike, or defenders units is within a 45 manner, that's for the siege game only, or your generals there. So you roll the dice, and every 4, 5 or 6 you roll is a morale failure, which could cause your unit to just stand where it is. If there's 1 dice that's failed, you could have to fall back with 2 fails, and 3 or more fails is run, so you have to take a dice test then for every unit in that square who might then actually rout from the field. Discussion on movement. So we have standard movement. Foote can move 2 bases, cavalry can move 2 squares, cavalry can move 4 squares. If the square in front, once you've finished movement, if the square in front of you isn't occupied by enemy, then you can move you can move to an extra square so long as it's not into proximity of an enemy unit. So movement can be quite quick in this game, and it has to be because each player only has 4 turns, so there's a definite incentive to get on and get at the enemy and achieve your objective. Discussion for saving throws here. This is relevant for any unit that receives any hits from fighting, shooting or morale, with a 4, 5, 6 being the baseline, which is modified by quality of troops, whether you're defending something nice which is keeping you safe, whether you're cavalry, etc, etc, and each fail is half a base lost. So units can choose to fall back if they've been assaulted. If you think the risk is worth it to try and save the unit, but of course you could get caught and absolutely destroyed if that goes wrong. You can fall back if forced to do so by a double morale failure, or if you are beaten in a fight. And it is the fighting where this game is decided with the old push of pike, and who can push the hardest will win the game, undoubtedly, as was true in real life. So there's different rules for pistilla and charger cavalry, multiple assaults from multiple squares. Discussion here about casualty markers. Every killed half base is replaced by a single casualty marker, and then you will have to take a subsequent morale test next time that unit activates. Here is the assault mechanism. So you assault a square will generate a pile of d6 totaled here. After all d6 are added up, the minimum number of d6 for an assaulter is two dice. So even something like an artillery gun that's charged by cavalry will still have 2 dice and may do something that will halt the charge. And then the target has a separate table to generate some dice from. The onus is on the attacker to win the assault. If it's a draw or they lose the assault, then the target square wins. And here we see the fight outcomes after a fight. If a target unit chooses to fall back, if the assaulter wins and achieves more casualties, or if the target achieves more or the same casualties. Now, cavalry in an assault are prone to leave the field as they charge off after the baggage, and they can do that and actually raid the baggage off table and gain some victory points. But you have to weigh that up with actually losing that unit from the game, and whether they'd be more useful on the table harassing the rear lines of the enemy. And here we see the mechanism for cavalry pursuit and flight. And then we have shooting, which is 5s or 6s to hit. So you will roll per base of muskets that you have, looking to roll 5s or 6s and then causing a save. Artillery shooting is also in the opponent's phase, and isn't particularly a game winner, but it certainly can have an effect upon enemy morale just by taking them down a couple of stands or getting a couple of hits on a unit. And this tells you here how many dice to roll. So per musket, pistol base or dragoon base, you roll 1 dice, and then for light, medium, heavy artillery you roll 1, 2 or 3d6. And each unit that's firing on one particular square will combine their dice and roll them together. Then there's a section for reinforcements, some rules for sacking the baggage. If your cavalry pursue enemy off the table, they can go and raid the baggage, which will gain some victory points. Game length play is 8 turns, but that's 4 turns per player. The attacker will always have the odd numbered turns, so 1, 3, 5, 7, and the defender will have turns 2, 4, 6 and 8. You can try to extend the game if you think it's worthwhile, to try and recover. If you're in a good position just as the game's about to end, you can try to extend the game, but you might sacrifice some victory points. And there's the typical Peter Pig victory point table here, where some points values, for example, for each full base lost, that's 1 point, so a static value, or it might be a d6 roll, and we're given some expected values there. And then we have the narrative for victory points for battle games, with the winner's narrative and loser's narrative. So for a good win, it's pie and ale awaiting you with the general, and a loss, the general wishes to see you, but not for pie and ale. And then we move on to siege games. Now, I've not played this an awful lot, but I have played it 3 or 4 times. It's a really good system to recreate a siege game within the English Civil War. And sieges of fortified manors and manor houses was quite common throughout the wars, and this is a system with which you can recreate that. You basically recreate the layout of the fortified manor on the table, such as this. There's 3 different layouts, and then the attacker has to try and break through the walls or the barricades, and then obviously get inside the manor and take the building. So there's a full set of rules for that. That's a separate game really. Most of the mechanisms are the same, but there are a few differences. And there's the siege battle sheet, and that's a picture of a siege game in progress. This is still the 3x4 table. The edge on the left and the edge in the foreground are occupied by the attacker's army, and the defender is deployed inside the defences with 2 units off tables as reinforcements. The attacker's guns can be deployed 1 square in front of his normal deployment route, and you can see they're on this hill here. The attacker's guns can be deployed in and then the dice and clutter is off the table, so that's always nice. We have some optional rules, which is rules of volley fire, and then something called sprinkles, where there might be these are little bits of scenery that you can add to the table, which add to the feel of the game, and for each piece you get 2 victory points, no matter whether they're held by or not by units. Optional rule 3 is to parley, so you can, if you're in a really bad situation, there's a parley system where a general tries to extricate his army from a bad situation or nobly to save further bloodshed, and that will reduce the amount of loss. Some advice on books, films and TV programs that you can watch, which will give you the full experience of the rules. And then we're on to the historical scenarios. So these are great for if you just want to turn up at your own club and refight a historical game. So these are designed so you can play with the forces that you've got, so you don't need to build especially large forces. Apart from one battle, you can generally play with the same sort of forces that you play the standard game with. So it is the intention that each scenario should not require extra figures than a player might already have to hand. Thus the scenarios are accessible at short notice. The table size and army size have been adapted for these reasons. And playing the scenarios will give a feel for the battles of the war, and there's some notes about one or two bits of change, because obviously we don't do the pre-game sequence. We already know who the attacker and defender is, and they're really good fun to play. So we have Edge Hill, 1642. I wrote this one, the scenario for that, and there's the details of the troops that you need, where they're going to deploy, and a little bit of narrative around that. Then Mike wrote the Lansdowne scenario. This is a really interesting one, down in the southwest of England. It's Hopton and Waller, the classic protagonists. Again, all the details of how you play that game out. We have First Newbury, which was designed by Stuart. We have the hill in the centre here, round hill. Then all these enclosures which cause such problems, and then the common here, where a lot of the fighting with the cavalry took place. We have Cheriton by Chris Cunningham. Really interesting game, this one, with lots of scenery on the table, making movement particularly difficult. We have Crop Ready Bridge. This was another one that I designed, with the forces coming in from various sides of the table. We have Marston Moor. Now this is the one game that you will need slightly more figures for, and a slightly longer table. We played this at one of the Weymouth War Games weekends a few years ago now, I seem to remember, and it was incredible to have all of the troops laid out. But there's the on-table forces, as you can see. That it's probably the equivalent of two people's collections put together, I would suggest. So perhaps a club effort to recreate Marston Moor, but it was the largest battle of the English Civil Wars. Then we have Inverlochy up in the north in Scotland. That's by Stuart. We've got Montrose against Sir Duncan Campbell of Auchenbreck. Naseby, this is another one of mine. Now there's a slight amendment to this game, because I was keen to have Oakey's Dragoons behind these enclosures here, firing on Prince Rupert as he advanced, but I really needed to include, in fact there's a special rule, let me just see if I can see it. The game starts with 2 rounds of shooting from Oakey's Dragoons into the flank of Morris's cavalry. Once this is done, the Royalists take the first turn. What I should have added there is that the Oakey's Dragoons have to then withdraw. We did play this at my club, blimey, 2 or 3 years ago, and I forgot to say that, and the parliamentarian player used the Dragoons to come across the baseline of the Royalists, which was not historical and a bit of an unfair advantage. So if you're looking at this review and thinking about playing Naseby, after that special rule where they get 2 rounds of shooting, then Oakey's Dragoons have to withdraw back to the parliamentarian baseline. But we have all the well-known names of the English Civil War present here. We've got King, we've got Prince Rupert, we've got Fairfax, Cromwell, we've got Ireton, Maurice, Astley, Langdale, Skippon. They're all there. And obviously Naseby is a battle that I think every English Civil War fan would want to fight. And I've got Langport from 1645, one of the smaller games, and then there's the battle sheet that I was talking about, where you can download this free off the website. And then a little bit of a playtester roll of honour. Here's me. It says, I'm royalist and is held out in the Midlands for the King, a general who combines high church office with a military command, known as Bishop Bobby. There you go. That's very nice. And then we have an index and the markers. So there you go. That is Regiment of Foote. Now I'm hoping to play a solo game of this in the next few days. I'll film it and put it up on the channel so you can see how it works. It will be the standard game as opposed to one of the historical battles, although I may well do one of the historical battles as soon as I'll be getting the figures out. But it is one of my favourite sets of rules from Peter Pig. I highly recommend it. If you are averse to squares and grid based games, I would say give it a go. Just give it a go. If you know somebody who's got the rules, then please give it a go, because I'm fairly sure by the end of the game you'll have enjoyed yourself immensely. It'll actually look like an English Civil War battle, certainly how I imagine an English Civil War battle would have played out. You'll enjoy yourself, and it's a thoroughly enjoyable game, so highly recommended from me. Okay, so I have been Billy Goat, Wargaming, and until next time, stay safe, play nice, and always paint your figures.